Dear listener, let us journey together now, to a quiet corner of a world that lives on in maps and in memory. Our story takes place in the lands of Middle-earth, in the twilight of its third age. But we will not be visiting the great courts of kings, nor the deep, echoing minds of the dwarves, nor even the golden, timeless woods of the elves. Our journey begins in a much quieter place, a land of rolling green hills and gentle, winding streams, a peaceful, idyllic land known as the Shire. And our story will be told not through the eyes of the small, cheerful folk who live there, but through the eyes of a silent, lonely guardian who watches over them from the shadows. This is the story of the long watch of the Rangers of the North. Imagine the sun beginning its slow descent behind the green hills of the Westfarthing. A soft, golden light, the color of warm honey, spills across the landscape, bathing the patchwork of fields and the small, round doors of the hobbit holes in a gentle, peaceful glow. From the chimneys of these cozy, subterranean homes, thin, pale gray wisps of wood smoke begin to rise, carrying on the evening breeze the comforting, domestic scent of pipeweed and of suppers being prepared. In the distance, from the direction of a village inn, one can hear the faint, muffled sound of laughter and of a simple, cheerful song being sung. This is the Shire, a land that has known peace for so long that its inhabitants have forgotten that the rest of the world is not as safe, not as peaceful, as their own small, beloved corner of it. They are a simple, good-hearted people, their concerns focused on the growing of good food, the brewing of good ale, and the telling of good stories. They know nothing of the great, dark world that lies beyond their well-tended borders, and nothing of the silent, tireless guardians who ensure that that darkness never crosses them. On a low hill, hidden in a thicket of hawthorn and gorse, a man sits as still as the ancient stones around him. His name is Talîon, and he is one of the Dunedain, a ranger of the north. He is a descendant of the great kings of old, a man in whose veins flows the blood of Númenor. But the glory of his ancestors is now a distant memory, a story told in whispers around lonely campfires. Their great northern kingdom of Arnor has long since fallen into ruin, its magnificent cities now nothing but green, silent mounds, its people scattered and forgotten. And he and his kinsmen are now but a wandering, secretive folk, the last, quiet remnants of a lost age, their lives dedicated to a long and thankless watch. Talîon is wrapped in a cloak of a deep, mottled gray, the color of a northern twilight, a cloak that allows him to melt into the shadows of the landscape. His face is weathered and stern, his eyes the color of a winter sky, and they hold a deep, quiet watchfulness, the look of a man who has spent a lifetime scanning distant horizons for signs of danger. His dark hair is streaked with gray, though he is not yet old by the measure of his people. In his hand, he holds a simple, unadorned bow of yew, and at his side rests a long, plain sword in a worn, leather scabbard. These, and a keen knife, are his only weapons. But his greatest weapon is his knowledge of the wild, his ability to read the subtle language of the land, to understand the meaning of a broken twig, of a strange track in the mud, of a sudden, unnatural silence in the woods. From his hidden vantage point, he looks down upon the peaceful, rolling hills of the Shire, and a rare, faint smile touches his lips. He is watching over them, over the small, innocent folk who live their lives in a peaceful, sunlit world, entirely unaware of his presence, or of the dangers that he and his kinsmen keep at bay. They are guarding the Shire from the growing darkness in the world beyond. From the north, from the desolate, ruined lands of Angmar, and from the high, misty peaks of Mount Gundabad, the ancient enemies are beginning to stir once more. Goblins and wargs, and other, darker things, are beginning to creep southward again, their shadows growing longer in the twilight of the age. And it is the sworn duty of Talîon and his fellow rangers to patrol these lonely, empty lands, to intercept these creatures of darkness, to ensure that the peace of the Shire remains unbroken, that its simple, cheerful folk can continue to enjoy their meals and their songs, untroubled by the great, dark world that lies just beyond their borders. As the last sliver of the sun disappears below the horizon, and as the first, bright, evening stars begin to appear in the deep, violet sky, Talîon rises. The time for watching is over. The time for walking has begun. He moves with a silent, practiced grace, his feet making no sound on the soft turf. He melts into the gathering shadows, a gray ghost in a gray world, his long, lonely watch just beginning. He is a man who has no home, so that others may keep theirs. He is a forgotten king, who guards a people who do not know his name. He is a silent, tireless sentinel, standing on the border between the light and the encroaching darkness. And as he disappears into the night, a profound and beautiful quiet settles over the land, a peace that is deeper and more precious than its inhabitants could ever possibly know. The night deepened, and the land of Eriador unfolded before Talîon in a vast and silent tapestry of starlit hills and shadowed valleys. He moved eastward, away from the warm, gentle, and sleeping lands of the Shire, and into the great, empty wilderness that was his true home. This was the Lone Lands, a place that had once been the very heart of the great northern kingdom of Arnor, but was now a quiet, desolate, and windswept expanse, its former glory a distant memory, whispered only by the wind as it sighed through the tall, lonely grasses and the crumbling, ivy-choked ruins of ancient watchtowers. His journey was a silent and solitary one, his path lit by the cold, silver light of the stars. He moved with the tireless, loping gait of his people, a pace that could cover immense distances without seeming to hurry. His senses were alive to the subtle language of the night. He heard the distant, lonely cry of a hunting owl, he saw the faint, ghostly flicker of marshlights in a distant fun, and he felt the shift in the wind that carried the scent of rain from the far-off misty mountains. This land, though empty to the eyes of a common traveler, was, to him, a book filled with ancient and familiar stories. He knew every hill, every stream, every hidden path. He knew where the ancient kings had fought their great battles, and where the silent, green mounds marked the graves of heroes long forgotten. After several days of steady, eastward travel, he saw it rising from the plains, a great, conical hill that stood alone, its dark shape a stark and solitary silhouette against the star-dusted sky. This was Amon Sul, the Hill of Wind, known in the common tongue as Weathertop. In the elder days, in the time of the Great Kingdom, a magnificent watchtower had stood upon its summit, the greatest of the northern fortresses, and within its high chambers had been kept one of the 7 seeing stones, the Palantiri. But the tower had been destroyed centuries ago, in the long and terrible wars with the dark realm of Angmar. Now, only a great, broken ring of ancient, weathered stones remained upon its summit, like the shattered crown of a long-dead king. Talîon began his ascent. The path was steep and treacherous, but his feet found their familiar way among the loose stones and the thorny gorse. As he climbed, the wind grew stronger, a constant, mournful song that seemed to be filled with the echoes of all the sorrow and all the glory that this ancient hill had witnessed. He reached the summit just as the moon, a pale and slender crescent, was beginning to rise in the east. He stood for a long moment within the great, broken ring of stones, his gray cloak whipping around him in the wind, his gaze sweeping across the vast, dark, and empty lands that stretched out in all directions below him. He was a lonely sentinel, standing upon the ruins of a forgotten age, his watch as eternal and as unchanging as the stars above. He chose a sheltered spot in the lee of one of the great, fallen stones, and there, he began the quiet, practiced ritual of making his camp. He did not build a large, roaring fire, for a ranger's fire must provide warmth without attracting unwanted attention. He gathered a few, small, dry branches of heather and, using his flint and steel, he coaxed a small, smokeless flame into life. It was a tiny island of warmth and light in a vast, cold, and dark ocean of wilderness. He sat before it, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders, and he drew from his pack a small piece of dried meat and a hard, dry biscuit of whey bread, the simple, sustaining fare of his people. As he ate his meager meal, he stared into the small, dancing flames, and the fire seemed to awaken the memories that were always just beneath the surface of his quiet thoughts. He saw in the flames the reflected glory of a world long past. He saw the great island of Númenor, the land of the star, rising from the sea, a gift from the Vala to the great men of old who had stood with the elves in the great wars against the first Dark Lord. He saw its white cities, its tall towers, its wise and long-lived people, the ancestors of his own race. And he saw its fall, its pride and its glory swallowed by a great, dark wave, a punishment for its hubris, a tragedy that had haunted his people for all the long ages since. He saw the few survivors, led by the tall and noble Elendil, escaping the wreck of their homeland, their ships tossed upon the great, dark waves, carrying with them only a seedling of the white tree and the 7 seeing stones. He saw them land here, in Middle-earth, and establish the great kingdoms in exile, Gondor in the south, and here, in these very lands, the northern kingdom of Arnor. He saw the great city of Númenor, built by the shores of Lake Evendim, its towers gleaming in the light of the setting sun. And he saw this very hill, Weathertop, crowned with its magnificent tower, a beacon of hope and a bastion of strength, the great watchtower that guarded the heart of the kingdom. But the flames of the fire also showed him a darker story. He saw the great kingdom of Arnor, after 1,000 years of peace, weakened by internal strife, its strength divided as it was sundered into 3 smaller, rival kingdoms, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rudor. And he saw the rise of a new and terrible shadow in the north, in the cold, misty lands of Angmar. He saw the Witch King, the chief of the Ringwraiths, the lord of the Nazgul, establish his dark and terrible kingdom, his sole purpose the utter destruction of the northern Dúnedain. For 500 long and terrible years, the wars raged. He saw the armies of Angmar, a vast horde of orcs and evil men and other, darker creatures, sweeping down from the north. He saw the fall of Cardolan and Rudor. He saw the great watchtower upon this very hill besieged, captured, and burned to the ground. He saw the last kings of Arthedain fighting a long, desperate, and ultimately hopeless battle against an overwhelming tide of darkness. And he saw the final fall of the kingdom, the destruction of its last capital at Fernost, and the scattering of its people. The great kingdom was no more. Its cities were ruins, its people a broken and wandering folk. But the line of its kings, the line of Isildur, the son of Elendil, did not fail. The heirs were raised in secret in the hidden valley of Rivendell, and the shards of Narsil, the sword that had cut the ring from Sauron's hand, were preserved as an heirloom of their house. And the people themselves, the last of the Dúnedain of the north, did not surrender to despair. They faded into the shadows. They became a secret people, wanderers in their own lost land. They took up a new and lonely duty. They became the rangers, the silent guardians of the empty lands, their lives a long and thankless vigil, protecting the small, peaceful folk of the world from the lingering evils that still haunted the ruins of their ancient kingdom. Talîon sighed, a sound that was lost in the greater sighing of the wind. This was the weight he carried. This was the legacy of his people. A legacy of glory, of sorrow, and of an unbreakable, enduring duty. He looked up from the dying embers of his fire and out at the vast, dark, starlit land that stretched before him. He was a king without a crown, a soldier in a war that had never truly ended, a shepherd who guarded a flock that did not know his name. But his watch was not a burden to him. It was his purpose. It was his identity. It was the quiet, noble song of his people, a song that had been sung in the shadows for 1,000 lonely years, and a song that would continue until the great shadow in the east was finally defeated, or until the last of the Dunedain had passed from the world forever. He pulled his cloak tighter, and settled himself for the long, cold, and watchful night ahead. The first light of dawn, a pale and gentle gray, crept over the eastern horizon, slowly revealing the vast, silent, and empty lands that stretched out from the base of Weathertop. Talîon awoke from his light, ranger's sleep, not with a start, but with a slow, quiet awareness, his senses instantly attuned to the subtle symphony of the new day. He rose from his simple bed of heather and, with a series of swift, practiced, and almost ritualistic movements, he erased all trace of his presence from the ancient, broken ring of stones. He scattered the cold ashes of his small fire, allowing the wind to carry them away. He smoothed the ground where he had slept, and he replaced the few stones he had moved to create his small shelter. When he was finished, the summit of the great hill stood as it had for 1,000 years, silent, empty, and alone, holding its ancient secrets in a stony, patient embrace. He began his journey eastward once more, his long, tireless stride carrying him away from the open, windswept plains and into the tangled, ancient, and foreboding woods known as the Trollshaws. The air here was different. The open, clean sky of the plains was replaced by a thick, green canopy of ancient oak and beech trees, their gnarled, moss-covered branches intertwined like the arthritic fingers of sleeping giants. The light that filtered through the leaves was a dim, green, and watery light, and a profound, watchful silence seemed to hang in the still, damp air. This was a land that held deep and often dark memories. It was here, in these very woods, that the three trolls, Tom, Bert, and William, had been turned to stone by the wizard Gandalf many years before, and their strange, lumpy, stone forms could still be found in a small clearing, a constant, silent warning to any who might wander too far from the path. For several days, Talîon moved through these woods, a silent, gray shadow among the deeper shadows of the trees. He followed the winding course of the river Horwell, its waters a deep, cold, and secretive brown, its banks lined with the crumbling, ivy-choked ruins of the ancient kingdom of Rudor. He was not merely traveling, he was reading the land. His keen, gray eyes scanned the ground for any sign that was out of place, for any track that did not belong. He was searching for the telltale signs of orcs, or goblins, as the Hobbits called them, who would sometimes venture down from their strongholds in the high passes of the misty mountains. But for days, he found nothing but the tracks of deer, of foxes, and of the occasional, shy, wild boar. The woods, though filled with a deep and ancient sorrow, seemed to be at peace. It was on the 4th day of his journey through the Trollshaws that he found the first sign that something was amiss. He was kneeling by the bank of a small, unnamed stream, refilling his water skin, when his eyes caught a strange mark in the soft mud at the water's edge. It was not the track of any natural creature of these lands. It was a large, splayed, and heavy footprint, the unmistakable print of a great warg, one of the evil, wolf-like creatures that were often used as mounts by the orcs of the mountains. A cold knot of unease tightened in his stomach. It was not unheard of for a lone warg, driven by hunger, to wander this far south. But it was rare. And something about this track, its size, its depth, felt different. It felt purposeful. His demeanor changed instantly. The quiet, contemplative wanderer was gone, replaced by the keen, silent hunter. He drew his long sword from its scabbard, the familiar weight of it a quiet comfort in his hand. And with a grace that belied his weary, travel-worn appearance, he began to follow the trail. The tracks led him away from the stream and deeper into the most tangled and ancient part of the forest. He moved with a supernatural quiet, his feet making no sound on the thick carpet of fallen leaves. He read the trail with the skill of a master. A broken twig here, a patch of disturbed moss there, a single, coarse, black hair caught on a thorny branch, each was a word in a dark and dangerous story that only he could read. The trail was fresh, no more than a day old. And as he followed it, he realized with a growing sense of dread that this was not the track of a single, lone creature. He soon found other tracks, the smaller, more clumsy prints of goblins, their heavy, iron-shod boots leaving a clear and ugly scar upon the soft, green earth. This was not a lone hunter. This was a scouting party. For the rest of the day, he followed the trail, his senses on high alert, every shadow a potential ambush, every gust of wind a potential warning. As dusk began to fall, a strange and foul scent reached him on the breeze, the unmistakable, sickly sweet and acrid smell of a goblin camp. He slowed his pace, his movements now as silent and as patient as the ancient trees themselves. He crept forward, from shadow to shadow, until he reached a small, hidden clearing. And what he saw there confirmed his worst fears. It was a small, hastily made camp, and it was now abandoned. But the signs of its recent occupation were clear, and they were deeply disturbing. The remains of a small fire still smoldered at the center of the clearing, the bones of several rabbits scattered around it. But it was the other signs that filled him with a cold dread. Crude, spidery runes, the foul markings of the orcs of Gundabad, had been carved into the bark of the ancient trees that surrounded the clearing. And on the ground, half buried in the mud, he found a small, tattered piece of black cloth, a fragment of a banner bearing a strange and unfamiliar symbol, a single, red, unlidded eye. But the most alarming discovery of all was a series of strange markings that had been made in the mud near the fire pit. They were not just random scrawls. It was a map, a crude, but terrifyingly accurate, map of the very lands he patrolled. He could clearly make out the winding course of the river, the dark shape of the Trollshaws, and even the familiar, conical shape of Weathertop itself. And on the western edge of the map, there was a small, crudely drawn circle, a representation of a land that the goblins should have had no knowledge of, and no interest in, the Shire. A profound and terrible understanding dawned upon Talîon. This was not a random raiding party. This was not a small band of goblins driven from their mountain caves by hunger. This was an organized, intelligent, and purposeful scouting mission. The shadow in the north, the ancient evil that his people had fought against for so long, was not just stirring, it was planning. It was gathering information. It was looking south, its gaze falling upon the small, peaceful, and utterly defenseless land of the Hobbits. His long, quiet, and lonely watch, which had for so long been a duty of memory and of honor, was about to become a very real, and a very dangerous, war once more. He stood there for a long time in the gathering darkness of the Trollshaws, the foul scent of the abandoned goblin camp filling the air around him. He knew that his own personal, solitary patrol was no longer enough. The threat was too great, too organized. This knowledge, this terrible new discovery, had to be carried to others. He was no longer just a silent guardian. he now had to become a messenger. He looked eastward, through the dark and tangled branches of the trees, toward the distant, unseen peaks of the misty mountains. And beyond them, he knew, hidden in a deep and secret valley, lay the last homely house, the sanctuary of Rivendell, the home of Elrond Halfelden. It was a journey of many long and dangerous leagues. But his path was now clear. He turned his back on the foul, desecrated clearing, and with a new and urgent purpose in his heart, he melted back into the shadows of the ancient forest, his own quiet, personal watch now a part of a much larger, and a much darker, story. The decision was made. The crude map in the mud, the foul runes carved into the ancient trees, and the chilling symbol of the red eye had transformed Talîon's long, quiet watch into a mission of urgent warning. But before he would turn his face eastward toward the hidden valley of Rivendell, he knew he must first turn west, for a short while, toward the ancient settlement of Bree. Rivendell was a place of wisdom and of counsel, but it was a place isolated from the comings and goings of the common folk. Bree, on the other hand, was a crossroads. It was a place of news and of rumors, a place where travelers from both the north and the south would stop to rest their weary feet, and in the warmth of a tavern's hearth, would loosen their tongues. And Talîon, a man who had spent a lifetime learning to sift the truth from the chaff of idle talk, knew that the whispers of travelers could often reveal more than the grand pronouncements of kings. His journey westward, back through the Trollshaws, was now imbued with a new sense of purpose. He moved with a greater speed, his gray eyes no longer just passively observing the land, but actively searching, questioning. Every shadow seemed to hold a new menace, every distant sound a potential threat. The knowledge he now carried was a heavy burden, and it sharpened his senses to a razor's edge. He skirted the edges of the Etten Moors, the cold and troll-infested hills to the north, and he gave the ancient, barrow-haunted downs to the south a wide berth. These were places of old and sleeping evils, and he had no desire to awaken them. His path was a lonely one, through a land that was beautiful in its desolation, but a land that now felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the coming of a new and terrible winter. After several days of hard travel, he saw the familiar shape of the Bree Hill rising from the plains, a gentle, wooded slope that stood like a quiet, green sentinel at the edge of the wild. And nestled against its western side was the ancient town of Bree itself, surrounded by a deep ditch and a tall, thorny hedge. As he approached the west gate, he pulled the hood of his gray cloak low over his face, his weathered features becoming lost in shadow. He was known in Bree, as were all his kinsmen. The folk of the town, both the big people and the hobbits, knew of the strange, wandering folk from the wild, the grim-faced, silent men they simply called the Rangers. They were regarded with a mixture of suspicion, of fear, and of a grudging, unspoken respect. The Breelanders did not fully understand their purpose, but they knew that these men possessed a knowledge of the wild that they themselves had long ago lost, and that they often seemed to appear when trouble was brewing. Talîon entered the town as dusk was falling. The narrow, winding streets were filled with the familiar, comforting sounds of a community settling in for the night, the lowing of cattle being brought in from the fields, the cheerful shouts of children playing a final game before being called in for supper, the distant, rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But Talîon's destination was the heart of the town, its social center, the great and ancient inn known as the Prancing Pony. Imagine the inn now, its whitewashed walls and its thatched roof glowing warmly in the twilight. A brightly painted sign, showing a fat, white pony rearing up on its hind legs, swung gently in the evening breeze. As Talîon pushed open the heavy, round door, a wave of warmth and cheerful noise washed over him. The common room was filled with a lively, boisterous crowd. Local Bree men, with their brown hair and their ruddy, cheerful faces, sat at heavy wooden tables, drinking ale from earthenware mugs and arguing loudly about the price of crops and the prospects for the coming harvest. A number of hobbits from the nearby villages of Stadel and Coombe were also present, their faces wreathed in the fragrant, blue smoke of their long-stemmed pipes, their conversation a low, contented murmur of gossip and of family histories. And scattered amongst them were the travelers, the outlanders, men of different lands and different appearances, their faces travel-worn, their clothes dusty from the long roads. Talîon did not seek a table in the center of the room. Instead, he found a dark, quiet corner, far from the main hearth, a place where he could see and hear without being easily seen himself. He sat with his back to the wall, his long legs stretched out before him, his sword resting on the floor by his side. The innkeeper, a short, fat, and bustling man named Barlyman Butterbur, whose memory was famously unreliable but whose heart was as good as gold, came over to his table. He recognized the ranger, and his cheerful face grew a little more serious, a little more respectful. "Good evening to you, Strider," he said, using the name that the people of Bree had given to all of Talîon's kinsmen. "A cold night to be out on the road. What can I get for you? A pint of my best, perhaps?" Talîon simply nodded, and the innkeeper bustled away, soon returning with a dark, foaming pint of ale and a plate of bread and cheese. For a long while, Talîon sat in silence, nursing his ale, his keen, grey eyes scanning the room, his ears attuned to the complex tapestry of conversation that filled the air. He listened to the farmers' complaints about the weather, to the hobbits' endless discussions of genealogy, to the boasts of a group of dwarves who were traveling east toward the Blue Mountains. This was the normal, comforting, everyday music of Bree, the sound of a world at peace. But he was listening for a different kind of sound, for a discordant note in the familiar harmony. And then, he heard it. It came from a table near the great hearth, where a small group of travelers from the south were gathered. They were merchants, by the look of them, their clothes of a finer cut than those of the local Breelanders, but their faces were etched with a deep and unusual weariness. They spoke in low, hushed tones, as if they were afraid of being overheard. But Talîon's keen, ranger's hearing could pick out their words from across the noisy room. "The roads are no longer safe," one of the merchants whispered, his voice a low, worried rasp. "Even the Greenway, the old North Road, is not what it used to be. There are strange folk abroad, dark-faced men from the south, and whispers of orcs raiding even as far north as the Gap of Rohan. It is the shadow in the east," another of the merchants added, his voice even lower. They say that the Dark Tower of Mordor is being rebuilt. That the fires of the Great Mountain are stirring once more. And that something, an ancient and terrible evil, is gathering its strength in that black and barren land. Talîon's hand, which had been resting on the hilt of his sword, tightened. Mordor. It was a name he had not heard spoken aloud in many long years. It was a name that belonged to the old tales, to the ancient histories of the last great war. He had known, as had all the wise, that the shadow had never been completely defeated, that it was merely sleeping, biding its time. But to hear its name spoken now, in the common room of a country inn, by common merchants, meant that the shadow was no longer just a memory. It was becoming a present and a growing danger. "And there is more," a third merchant said, leaning in closer to his companions. "There are whispers of a creature, a strange and terrible creature, that has escaped from that dark land. A creature that is being hunted by the servants of the shadow, and by others as well. They say it is a small, furtive thing, but that it carries a great and terrible secret, a secret that the Dark Lord desires above all else. A cold chill, a feeling colder than the autumn night outside, crept into Talîon's heart. He did not know what this creature was, or what secret it carried. But a sudden, intuitive certainty, a flash of insight born of a lifetime spent reading the signs of a gathering darkness, told him that this news was connected to the strange events he had witnessed in the north. The orcs and the trollshaws, the map with its crude drawing of the Shire, the symbol of the red eye, it was all part of the same, great, dark web. The shadow was not just stirring in its ancient fortress in the east. It was reaching out. Its long, dark fingers were stretching northward, toward the quiet, forgotten lands of Eriador. And for some reason he could not yet fathom, its gaze was falling upon the small, insignificant, and utterly defenseless land of the Hobbits. He finished his ale, the dark, bitter taste a reflection of the thoughts that now filled his mind. He had found what he had come for. The whispers in this small country and had confirmed his deepest fears, and had given them a new and terrifying context. The threat was far greater, far more widespread, than he had imagined. His duty was now clearer than ever. He could not linger here. He had to carry this news, all of it, the story of the orcs in the north and the whispers of the rising shadow in the south, to the one place where such knowledge could be understood, to the one place where a council could be held and a plan could be formed. He rose from his dark corner, leaving a few small coins on the table for the innkeeper. As he moved toward the door, a silent, gray shadow, Barliman Butterbur caught his eye and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, a look of quiet understanding and of a deep, unspoken trust. Talîon returned the nod, and then, he pushed open the heavy door and stepped out once more into the cold, dark, and waiting night. The warm, cheerful light of the inn was behind him. The long, dark, and lonely road to Rivendell lay ahead. The heavy, oaken door of the prancing pony swung shut behind Talîon, its familiar, cheerful creak of final, fading farewell to the world of warmth, of light, and of the simple, everyday concerns of common folk. He stood for a moment in the cool, dark street, the night air a clean and welcome shock to his senses after the close, smoky atmosphere of the inn. The whispers he had heard within its walls, the tales of a rising shadow in the east and of a strange, hunted creature, now swirled in his mind, weaving themselves together with the grim evidence he had discovered in the trollshaws. The pattern was now clear, its implications vast and terrifying. His duty was no longer simply to watch and to guard, it was to warn. He pulled his gray cloak tighter around him, a silent, shadowy figure against the dim, yellow lamplight of the sleeping town, and with a final, lingering glance at the peaceful homes of Bree, he turned his face eastward and melted into the great, waiting darkness of the wild. The journey that now lay before him was the longest and most perilous leg of his patrol. He was bound for the hidden valley of Imladris, known in the common tongue as Rivendell, the last homely house east of the sea. But to reach that secret sanctuary, he would have to cross the vast, empty, and haunted expanse of the Lone Lands, a journey of many weary leagues through a country that was now almost entirely deserted, save for the whispering ghosts of its own long-forgotten history. He left the familiar Bree land behind, and the landscape began to change, growing wilder, more desolate, with each passing day. The rolling, gentle hills gave way to a vast, windswept plain, a great, empty sea of tough, gray-green grass that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional, lonely tors and the crumbling, vine-choked ruins of ancient farmsteads and forgotten watchtowers. This was the land that had once been the heart of the great northern kingdom, a land that had once been filled with prosperous towns and fertile fields. Now, it was a place of profound and beautiful melancholy, a land that seemed to be forever dreaming of a glory that had long since passed from the world. Talîon moved through this empty land with a quiet and relentless purpose. He traveled mostly by night, resting during the day in hidden dells or among the silent, standing stones of some long-forgotten burial ground. The stars were his map, the wind his only companion. He did not feel the loneliness of this land as a burden. He was a part of it, its silence and its sorrow a reflection of the long, lonely history of his own people. He was a living ruin, walking among the ruins of his ancestors. His path led him toward the Great East Road, the ancient highway that had once connected the kingdoms of old. But the road was now little more than a faint, green track through the wilderness, its great paving stones broken and scattered, its bridges long since fallen into the swift, cold streams they had once spanned. He followed its general course, for it still offered the most direct path eastward. But his senses were now on a higher state of alert than ever before. The whispers from Bree had given a new and terrible context to the signs he had discovered in the trollshaws. He knew now that the servants of the enemy were abroad, and that they were searching for something. As he traveled, he began to encounter more and more signs of this growing darkness. He found the tracks of orc bands, far more numerous and more recent than those he had found before. He saw, from a distance, the faint, flickering light of their foul, smoky fires in the dead of night. And one evening, as he lay hidden on a high ridge, he saw a sight that chilled him to the bone. A small company of travelers, merchants by the look of them, were making their way along the old road below. And from the shadows of a rocky outcrop, a group of dark, hunched figures, orcs of the mountains, fell upon them in a swift and brutal ambush. Talîon, alone and outnumbered, could do nothing but watch in silent, helpless rage as the travelers were overwhelmed. He was a guardian, a protector, but he could not be everywhere at once. The darkness was growing, and his own small, lonely efforts felt like trying to hold back the tide with his bare hands. He pressed on, his heart now heavy with a new sense of urgency. His journey took him through the Midgewater marshes, a vast and treacherous bog, a maze of stagnant pools and thick, white mists that seemed to cling to the ground even on the brightest of days. The air here was thick and heavy, filled with the constant, maddening hum of countless biting flies and the low, mournful croaking of unseen things in the reeds. It was a place of illusion and of despair, a place where a traveler could easily lose their way and wander for days, until they finally sank into the cold, dark water, their passing unmourned and unseen. But Talîon knew these marshes well. He knew the secret, hidden paths, the narrow strips of solid ground that wound their way through the treacherous bog. He moved through the thick, disorienting mists like a ghost, his feet sure and steady, his gaze fixed on the distant, unseen goal that lay beyond this watery wasteland. After many days, he finally emerged from the marshes, and he saw them, rising in the east like a great, jagged wall of dark, broken teeth against the sky, the Hithiglir, the misty mountains. They were a formidable and awe-inspiring sight, their high peaks perpetually shrouded in cloud, their slopes a dark and forbidding tangle of pine and fir. For centuries, these mountains had been a bastion of evil, their deep, subterranean caves and tunnels infested with goblins and other, darker creatures. But somewhere within their western foothills, hidden in a deep and secret valley, protected by the ancient and powerful magic of the elves, lay his destination. As he drew closer to the mountains, the land began to rise, the gentle plains giving way to a rugged, broken country of steep-sided hills and deep, narrow valleys. The air grew colder, cleaner, and it carried the scent of pine and of distant, high-altitude snow. He could hear the sound of the mountains now, a low, constant murmur that was not just the sound of the wind in the high passes, but the sound of countless, rushing streams and waterfalls, the Bruinen and its sister rivers, making their swift and noisy journey down from the high snowfields to the plains below. This was the land of the Angle, a place where the great rivers Loudwater and Horwell met, a land that had once been home to the Stors, a branch of the Hobbit folk, long before they had migrated west to the Shire. But they were long gone now, and the land was empty, save for the silent, watching trees and the crumbling ruins of their forgotten towns. Talîon felt a strange kinship with this land, a place that, like himself, was filled with the quiet, lingering memory of a lost people. He was now in the final and most dangerous stage of his journey. The foothills of the Misty Mountains were a treacherous and confusing maze of hidden valleys and steep, winding paths. The servants of the enemy were numerous here, and he had to use all of his ranger's skill, all of his knowledge of stealth and of woodcraft, to avoid their watchful eyes. He moved now only in the deepest shadows of the night, resting during the day in caves or in the high, hidden branches of the ancient pine trees. He felt the call of his destination now, a silent, urgent pull in his spirit. It was the call of Rivendell, the call of sanctuary, of wisdom, of hope. It was the promise of a warm fire, of a friendly voice, of a counsel of the wise who might be able to make sense of the dark and fragmented knowledge that he carried. But it was also the call of duty, the urgent need to deliver his warning, to play his own small, but crucial, part in the great and gathering struggle against the shadow. He stood on a high ridge, looking out at the great, dark, and formidable wall of the mountains before him. Somewhere in that impassable barrier of rock and ice, there was a hidden path, a secret entrance to a hidden valley. He did not know exactly where it was, but he knew he was close. He could feel it. He took a deep breath of the cold, clean, mountain air, and with his gaze fixed on the eastern sky, where the first, faint light of a new day was beginning to appear, he began his final descent, following the sound of the rushing water, following the silent, hopeful call of the last homely house. The air in the high foothills of the Misty Mountains was thin, cold, and sharp, like a freshly honed blade. It carried on its clean currents the ancient scent of pine, of wet stone, and of the distant, high, and lonely snowfields. Talîon stood on a high ridge, the first, pale light of dawn painting the eastern sky in soft shades of rose and pearl behind him. Below him, the world was a deep, dark, and churning ocean of mist and shadow. He had traveled for many long and weary leagues, and he knew, with the quiet, instinctive certainty of his people, that his destination was near. He could feel it. It was a faint, subtle hum in the very air around him, a feeling of peace, of ancient power, and of a deep, abiding magic that seemed to seep from the very bones of the earth. This was the hidden valley of Imladris, the last homely house east of the sea, known in the common tongue as Rivendell. He began his final descent, following not a clear path, but the sound of rushing water. He knew that the entrance to the hidden valley was guarded by the swift-flowing river Bruinen, the Loudwater, and its secret ford. The way down was steep and treacherous, a winding, almost invisible track that led through a dense forest of ancient pine and fir trees. He moved with a profound and reverent quiet, for he knew he was now treading upon sacred ground, a land that had been protected from the evils of the world for thousands of years by the power of the elven lords. The silence here was different from the empty, sorrowful silence of the lone lands. This was a silence that was alive, a quiet that was filled with the murmur of unseen things, with the rustle of leaves that seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and with the feeling of being watched by old, wise, and benevolent eyes. As he drew closer to the river, he heard the sound of its rushing waters growing louder, a powerful, constant, and musical roar. he emerged from the dark woods and stood upon its bank. The river was a churning, white-water torrent, its waters cold and clear as they tumbled over great, gray, moss-covered boulders. And on the far side of the river, nestled deep within a hidden, secret valley, he saw it. The first sight of Rivendell is something that, once seen, can never be truly forgotten. It was not a city of stone in the manner of men, nor a fortress built for war. It was a place that seemed to have grown from the very landscape itself, a perfect and harmonious fusion of nature and of art. Slender, graceful buildings with soaring, elegant roofs were nestled among the trees on the valley floor. Graceful, white bridges, which seemed to be spun from moonlight, arched over the rushing waters of the river. And everywhere, there was the sound of singing, a beautiful, clear, and otherworldly sound that seemed to be a part of the very air, of the water, and of the light itself. And as the sun began to rise over the high, misty peaks of the mountains to the east, its golden light spilled down into the valley, and 1,000 windows, which had been dark just moments before, now suddenly blazed with a brilliant, reflected fire. Talîon waded across the shallow, stony ford, the cold, swift water a shocking and welcome balm on his weary legs. As he stepped onto the far bank, he was met by 2 tall and graceful figures. They were elves of the household of Elrond, clad in simple, grey garments, their faces beautiful and ageless, their eyes holding the deep, starlit wisdom of a people who have seen the long ages of the world unfold. They did not seem surprised to see him. They greeted him not with suspicion, but with a quiet, gentle welcome, speaking his own name, Talîon, in their clear, musical tongue. In this hidden valley, few things arrived unexpected. They led him up a winding path, through gardens of breathtaking beauty, where flowers bloomed that had long since vanished from the rest of the world. The air was filled with a fragrance so sweet and so pure it seemed to wash away the weariness of his long journey. He was brought to the last homely house itself, a long, low, and beautiful building, its halls open to the sky, its great rooms filled with the sound of music and of waterfalls. He was offered a warm bath, clean clothes of soft linen, and a cup of a fragrant, golden wine that seemed to chase away the last of the chill from his bones. After he had rested, he was brought to the great hall of Elrond. Imagine the scene. It is a long, beautiful hall, its high, timbered roof supported by great, carved pillars shaped like living trees. The air is filled with the soft, golden light of many lamps and the sound of a harp being played by an unseen hand. At the head of the hall, seated in a great, carved chair, is the Lord of Rivendell himself, Elrond Halfelden. His face is ageless, neither old nor young, but marked with the immense wisdom and the profound, quiet sorrow of one who has lived through all the long and changing ages of the world. His eyes are as grey as a clear twilight, and they seem to hold the light of the stars within them. Beside him sits his daughter, the beautiful Arwen Undamil, the even star of her people, her beauty so great that it was said to be the likeness of Luthien Tinuviel of old, the fairest of all the children of the world. And in the hall are gathered other elves, and other wise folk, their faces noble and fair, their presence a quiet testament to the enduring power of this hidden sanctuary. Talîon stood before the Elven Lord, and for the first time in many long and lonely years, he did not feel the need to hide his weariness or his worry. In the presence of Elrond, he felt a profound sense of peace, of coming home. He gave a deep and respectful bow. "My Lord Elrond," he said, his voice, which had grown rough from long disuse, now quiet and clear in the great, still hall. "I have come from the north. I bring dark tidings." And so, he told his story. He spoke of the signs he had seen in the trollshaws, of the goblin tracks and the crude, foul runes. He told of the abandoned camp, and of the map in the mud, and of the symbol of the red eye. And he spoke of the whispers he had heard in Bree, of the growing shadow in the east, of the strange, hunted creature, and of the great fear that was beginning to spread along the roads. He spoke for a long time, his voice a low and steady murmur in the quiet hall, and as he spoke, the elven lords listened with a grave and unbroken attention. When he had finished, a long silence fell over the hall, a silence filled with the weight of his dark tidings. It was Elrond who finally broke the silence. His voice was as deep and as clear as the night sky. "You have done well, Talîon of the Dunedain," he said. "You have been a true and vigilant watchman. The signs you have seen are indeed troubling. They confirm what we have long feared. The shadow is stirring once more. The peace of our age is coming to an end. A great and terrible war is coming, and soon it will touch even the quietest and most forgotten corners of this world." He then spoke of many things that were beyond Talîon's own knowledge. He spoke of the rings of power, of the long and sorrowful history of the Second Age, of the last alliance of elves and men, and of the great shadow, Sauron, who had been defeated but not destroyed. And he spoke of the one, great hope that remained, that a hero would one day arise from the scattered remnants of the Dunedain, the heir of Isildur, who would wield the broken sword that had been preserved here, in this very house, and who would lead the free peoples in the final struggle against the darkness. Talîon stayed in Rivendell for many days, a brief and blessed respite from his long and lonely watch. He walked in the beautiful gardens, he listened to the ancient songs of the elves, and he felt the great weariness of his spirit being slowly, gently healed by the peace and the beauty of that hidden valley. For a few short days, he was not a hunted wanderer, but an honored guest. He was not a lonely sentinel, but a part of a great and noble company. He sat in council with the wise, and he learned that his own small, lonely struggle was but a single thread in a great and epic tapestry, a tapestry of hope and of sorrow, of light and of shadow, that was being woven by the hands of a destiny far greater than his own. But he knew that he could not stay here forever. His place was in the wild, on the lonely borders of the world, on the front lines of the long, quiet war against the darkness. And so, after a time, his strength restored, his spirit renewed, and his purpose clarified, he made his farewells to the Elven Lord. He left the hidden valley of Rivendell, and he returned to the wild lands of the north, back to his long and lonely watch. But he carried with him now a new knowledge, and a new hope. The starlight of Rivendell, the memory of its beauty and its wisdom, would be a light for him in the dark places, a quiet, inner fire that would sustain him through all the long, cold, and watchful nights that were still to come. Talîon's days in the hidden valley of Imladris passed like a beautiful, half-remembered dream. The peace of that place was a potent and healing balm, a quiet magic that seemed to soothe the deep, ancient weariness in his soul. He walked the graceful, white bridges that arched over the rushing waters of the Bruinen, he listened to the ancient, sorrowful songs of the elves as they drifted through the halls at twilight, and he spoke at length with the wise and the noble of Elrond's household. For the first time in many long years, he was not entirely alone. He was a part of a community, a shared fellowship of purpose against the gathering darkness. He had delivered his dark tidings, and he had seen in the grave faces of Elrond and the other elven lords that his fears were not only confirmed but were part of a much larger and more terrible shadow than he had ever imagined. He now understood that the stirring of orcs in the north and the whispers of a rising power in the south were not separate threats, but two arms of the same great, dark creature, a creature that was slowly, patiently, beginning to awaken from its long and troubled slumber. He waited now for the counsel of the wise, ready to receive his orders, his own will now subsumed into the greater cause of the free peoples of Middle-earth. It was on his 4th evening in the valley that he was summoned once more to the great hall of Elrond. But this time, the hall was not filled with the gentle music of the harp, but with a profound and watchful silence. A great fire burned in the central hearth, its dancing flames casting long, flickering shadows on the high, carved pillars. And standing before the fire, deep in conversation with the Lord of Rivendell, was a new figure. He was an old man, cloaked in a simple, travel-worn grey robe, his long, white beard tucked into his belt, a tall, pointed hat upon his head. But his eyes, beneath the brim of his hat, were not the eyes of a simple, old man. They were keen, bright, and filled with a deep, ancient, and almost mischievous wisdom, the eyes of one who has seen the very foundations of the world being laid, and who has laughed and wept with it through all its long and sorrowful ages. This was Gandalf the Grey, the Mithrandir, the Grey Pilgrim, one of the Istari, the great wizards who had been sent from across the sea to aid the free peoples in their struggle against the Shadow. As Talîon entered the hall, the two great figures turned to him. "Come, Talîon," Elrond said, his voice a calm and steady presence in the quiet hall. "There is much to discuss, and little time." Gandalf looked at the ranger, and his keen eyes seemed to pierce through Talion's weary, weathered exterior, to see the quiet, resilient strength that lay within. "I have heard the tale of your watch, son of the Dunedain," the wizard said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, like the sound of stones moving deep within the earth. "You have been a true and vigilant guardian. But your lonely watch is now at an end. A new and more perilous task now awaits you." The three of them sat by the fire, and as the shadows danced around them, Gandalf began to speak. And the story he told was a secret history of the world, a tale of magic, of power, and of a single, terrible object that now threatened to undo all the victories of the past. He spoke of the rings of power, forged in the Second Age by the great elven smiths. And he spoke of the one, Dark Lord, Sauron of Mordor, who had secretly forged his own ring, the One Ring, the ruling ring, pouring into it his own malice, his own will, and his own power to dominate all life. He told of the last alliance of elves and men, of the great war in which the Dark Lord had been overthrown, and of how the ring had been cut from his hand by Isildur, Talion's own great ancestor. But the ring was not destroyed, Gandalf said, his voice now a low and somber whisper. Isildur, in a moment of weakness, claimed it for his own, and the ring, which has a will of its own, betrayed him to his death in the waters of the great river. And there, for 2,500 years, it lay hidden, lost to the world, a forgotten memory. But evil does not sleep forever. And some years ago, the ring was found. He then told the strangest and most unsettling part of the story. He spoke of a small, river-dwelling creature, who had once been a hobbit-like person named Smeagol. This creature had found the ring in the mud of the river, and its dark, corrupting power had twisted his mind and his body, transforming him over 500 long and lonely years into a strange, furtive, and pitiable being known only as Gollum. The ring had prolonged his life unnaturally, but it had consumed him, his entire existence now a desperate, obsessive love for his precious. He had carried the ring into the deep, dark, goblin-infested tunnels beneath the misty mountains, and there he had hidden with it for centuries, a miserable, lonely creature in a world of his own making. But the ring has a will of its own, Gandalf repeated. And it desires to return to its master. It abandoned Gollum. And it was found, by the most unlikely of chances, by another traveler, a hobbit from the very land you have so long guarded, Talîon. A profound silence fell over the hall, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Talîon looked at the old wizard, his mind reeling. The Shire. The small, peaceful, and seemingly insignificant land of the Hobbits was now at the very center of this great and terrible story. The Shadow is searching for it, Gandalf continued. Sauron has learned that the ring has been found. His spies are everywhere. He has sent forth his most terrible servants, the 9 ringwraiths, the Nazgul, to scour the lands. And they are searching for the Shire, and for the name of Baggins. And what of this creature, this Gollum? Talîon asked, his voice a low whisper. That is the reason for this council, Gandalf said, his keen eyes meeting Talîon's. Gollum, too, has emerged from his long darkness, driven by the loss of his precious. He has been captured by the servants of Mordor, and under terrible torture, he has revealed 2 words, Shire, and Baggins. But he has since escaped. He is now a creature of immense importance. He knows the location of the Shire, and he knows the name of the ring's new bearer. He is being hunted, by the servants of the Shadow, and by us. The elves of Mirkwood have been searching for him. And your own kinsman, Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the heir of Isildur himself, is also on his trail. Elrond then spoke, his voice filled with a quiet authority. We believe that Gollum is now making his way westward, perhaps drawn by some faint, desperate memory of the lands where the ring was once held. He may be seeking the Gladden fields, where Isildur fell, or he may even be making for the Shire itself. He must be found. He must be captured. The knowledge he carries is too dangerous to be left to wander the wild. And then, Gandalf looked directly at Talîon, and his gaze was as sharp and as penetrating as a winter star. Your long watch in the north has given you a knowledge of these lands that few possess, the wizard said. You know the hidden paths, the secret ways. You know how to read the signs of the wild. You know how to move unseen. We now ask you to take up a new task, a new watch. Aragorn is searching for the creature in the south, along the banks of the great river Anduin. But we need another to guard the northern approaches, to search the lands between the misty mountains and the Greenway. We need you, Talîon of the Dunedain, to join the hunt for Gollum. It was not a request. It was a charge, a mission of immense and perilous importance. The task of a lonely watchman was being transformed into the quest of a hunter. He was no longer just a guardian of a quiet border, he was now an agent in a great and secret war, a war whose outcome would determine the fate of all Middle-earth. Talîon rose to his feet. He looked at the 2 great and wise figures before him, at the Lord of Rivendell and the Grey Pilgrim. He thought of his long, lonely years in the wild, of the crumbling ruins of his ancestors, and of the quiet, peaceful, and unsuspecting folk of the Shire. He thought of the new and terrible darkness that was gathering on the horizon. He was just one man, a single, grey shadow in a vast and darkening world. But his duty was clear. His path was now set. I will do it, he said, his voice quiet, but filled with a new and unshakable resolve. I will hunt for this creature. I will not rest until he is found. And so, his brief and blessed respite in the hidden valley came to an end. He did not linger. He gathered his simple gear, he refilled his satchel with the nourishing elven waybread, lembas, and he sharpened the blade of his long, plain sword. He made his quiet farewells, and as the first, pale stars of a new evening began to appear in the sky above the valley, he left the last homely house behind him. He walked back out into the wild, but this time, he was not just a lonely watchman. He was a man with a mission, a hunter with a specific prey, his face turned now not just to the empty lands, but to the deep and growing shadows that lay within them. The task of the Grey Wizard had been given, and it had been accepted. The hunt had begun. The taste of elven wine and the memory of a warm, safe fire faded quickly as Talîon journeyed south from the hidden valley of Rivendell. He was once again a solitary figure in a vast and empty world, his only companions the wind and the stars. He followed the western foothills of the great misty mountains, a colossal, jagged wall of stone and ice that formed the very spine of the world. He traveled with a new and heavy purpose in his heart. He was no longer just a watchman, a guardian of quiet borders. He was a hunter. And his quarry was a creature of darkness and of deep, ancient misery, a creature that knew the secret of the One Ring. For many weeks, he journeyed southward, through the wild and untamed lands of Rovanion. This was a land that had seen the great ages of the world unfold. He passed through the Gladden Fields, a great, marshy land where the mighty Anduin River slowed and spread into 1,000 small streams and quiet, reedy pools. It was a place of great beauty, of water lilies and the quiet flash of a kingfisher's wing. But it was also a place of profound sorrow, for it was here, in these very waters, that his own great ancestor, Isildur, had been slain by orcs 2,500 years before. And it was here that the great ring of power, the very object at the heart of this new and gathering darkness, had been lost, slipping from the dead king's finger and into the deep, silent mud of the river, where it had slept, and waited, for centuries. Talîon paused here for a time, a silent, grey figure among the whispering reeds, his heart filled with a deep and somber sense of connection to the long, tragic history of his people. He continued his journey south, his path now leading him away from the great river and toward a land that was spoken of only in hushed, fearful tones, a land that even the orcs of the mountains gave a wide berth. He was approaching the Daggerlad, the ancient battle plain, the place where the last alliance of elves and men had fought their great and terrible battle against the armies of Mordor at the end of the Second Age. The land here grew flat, barren, and desolate. The cheerful, green grass of the river valleys gave way to a sparse, grey, and thorny scrub. The air grew still and heavy, and a strange, foul smell, the scent of ancient decay and of a sorrow so deep it had poisoned the very earth itself, began to drift on the wind. And then, he saw them. Stretching to the horizon, under a sky of a pale and sickly grey, lay the great, stagnant pools and the treacherous, shifting mires of the dead marshes. Imagine the scene. A vast, flat, and featureless landscape, a great, shallow fen of black, oily water and soft, treacherous mud, dotted with islands of tough, grey reeds and the skeletal, white arms of long-dead willow trees. A thick, white, and clammy mist clung to the surface of the water, a mist that seemed to muffle all sound, creating a profound and unnatural silence. This was a place of death, a great, watery graveyard where the bodies of the elves and men and orcs who had fallen in the great battle had been swallowed by the soft, hungry earth, their final resting place now a haunted and accursed swamp. Talîon knew that the creature he sought, Gollum, had passed this way. The elves of Mirkwood, who had briefly held Gollum captive, had told Gandalf that the creature had spoken of a great, dark marsh, a place of ghosts and of dead things, a place he had passed through on his long, secret journey out of the dark land of Mordor. And so, Talîon knew that he too must cross this terrible place. He began his journey into the marshes with a profound sense of caution. He did not travel by day, for in the open, featureless landscape, he would be an easy target for any watchful eyes from the mountains of Mordor to the east. He traveled only in the deepest darkness of the night, his path lit by the pale, cold, and distant light of the stars. The ground here was treacherous, a shifting, sucking mud that could swallow a man whole. He moved slowly, carefully, testing each footstep with his long staff before trusting his full weight to it. He followed the faint, almost invisible paths, the narrow, winding strips of firmer ground that only a ranger, with his deep knowledge of such wild and dangerous places, could hope to find. As he ventured deeper into the heart of the great marsh, he began to see the lights. They were pale, ghostly, and cold, like the light of a dying star. They flickered and danced just above the surface of the dark, still water. These were the corpse candles, the strange, ethereal lights that were said to be the spirits of the dead, forever haunting the place where their bodies had fallen. As he drew closer, he looked down into the black, mirror-like water, and he saw them. Faces. The pale, gaunt, and sorrowful faces of the long-dead warriors, their eyes open and staring, their hair floating like seaweed in the still, dark water. They were the faces of elves, of men, and of orcs, all of them now bound together in a single, silent, and eternal company of death. It was a sight of profound and heartbreaking sorrow, a silent testament to the terrible, indiscriminate cost of war. For days, he traveled through this haunted, watery labyrinth. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the reeds, the low, mournful croaking of unseen things in the mire, and the soft, sucking sound of his own boots in the mud. He ate little, his elven waybread his only sustenance. He drank the dark, brackish water of the marsh only when his thirst became unbearable, purifying it first with the secret herbs that he carried in his pouch. And all the while, he searched. His keen, ranger's eyes scanned the soft mud and the damp, peaty earth for any sign, any track, that might reveal the passage of his quarry. And then, on the fourth night of his journey through the great marsh, he found it. At the edge of a particularly large and stagnant pool, half hidden among a clump of gray, withered reeds, he saw a single, clear footprint in the soft mud. It was not the print of a man, nor of an orc. It was a small, splayed, and web-like print, the unmistakable track of the creature known as Gollum. A thrill of a hunter's satisfaction, cold and sharp, went through him. He knelt down, examining the track with a practiced eye. The print was deep, suggesting the creature was moving with some haste. And it was fresh, no more than a day or two old. He was on the right path. He followed the trail of footprints as it wound its way through the most treacherous and difficult parts of the marsh. And as he followed, he began to learn something of the creature he was hunting. The tracks did not follow the firmer, safer paths. Instead, they often led directly through the deep, sucking mire, or skirted dangerously close to the deep, dark pools where the corpse candles burned their brightest. This was a creature, he realized, that was at home in such a desolate and sorrowful place. It was a creature that knew the secret ways of the marsh, a creature that did not fear the dead, for it was, in its own way, already one of them. And as he followed the trail, a new and unsettling feeling began to take hold. He felt, once again, that he was being watched. But this was not the feeling of a hunter stalking him from behind. It was a different kind of feeling, a sense of a furtive, cunning intelligence that was always just ahead of him, watching him from the cover of the reeds, leading him deeper and deeper into the heart of the great, haunted swamp. He was the hunter, but he was also, he now realized, the hunted. This was not a simple chase. It was a duel of wits, a contest of stealth and of cunning, played out in a landscape of death and of deep, ancient sorrow. He pressed on, his resolve now hardened by this new and dangerous understanding. He knew that he was close. He knew that the creature could not be far ahead. And he knew that he had to find it, to capture it, before it could reach the safety of the mountains, before it could deliver its terrible secret to the growing shadow in the east, and before his own long, lonely journey ended here, in the cold, silent, and unforgiving embrace of the dead marshes. He clutched the hilt of his sword, its familiar, solid weight a small comfort in this world of shadow and illusion, and with his eyes fixed on the faint, strange tracks in the mud before him, he moved forward, alone, gray shadow in a land of the dead, his great and perilous hunt now entering its most dangerous phase. Leaving the desolate, sighing reeds and the ghostly corpse candles of the dead marshes behind him, Talîon journeyed northward, his gaze now fixed upon the great, dark wall of forest that loomed on the eastern horizon. For weeks, it had been a distant, somber line, a mere shadow in the landscape. But as he drew closer, it rose to become a formidable and unbroken barrier, a sea of ancient, dark green trees that seemed to swallow the very light of the sky. This was Mirkwood the Great, known in the elder days as Greenwood the Great, a forest that had once been a place of beauty and of light, but which had, over the long and wearying centuries of the Third Age, fallen under the shadow of a dark and nameless sorcerer who had built his fortress of Dol Guldur upon its southern hills. The forest was now a place of fear, a tangled, enchanted, and deeply malevolent wood, and it was into this great darkness that the trail of the creature Gollum now led. Talîon paused at the edge of the forest, at the eaves of Mirkwood. He stood for a long moment, a silent, grey figure under the shade of the first great, ancient trees, and he took a deep breath. The air here was different from the clean, open air of the plains. It was thick, heavy, and still, and it carried a strange, sweet, and cloying scent of decay and of a deep, ancient, and slumbering life. There was no sound of birdsong here. The cheerful chatter of the forest creatures was absent. The only sound was the low, almost imperceptible hum of the forest itself, a sound that was not a sound at all, but a feeling, a pressure in the air, the feeling of being watched by a million unseen, ancient, and unfriendly eyes. He knew that to enter this forest was to enter a different world, a world that operated by its own dark and twisted rules, a world where the very air, the very trees, the very shadows, could be your enemy. But the trail of his quarry led inward, and his duty was clear. With a final, lingering look at the open, sunlit lands behind him, he drew his grey cloak tighter around his shoulders, and he stepped into the great, green twilight of the wood. The change was immediate and profound. The moment he passed beneath the first great, tangled branches, the light of the outside world seemed to be extinguished. He was now in a vast, dim, and greenlit hall, its roof a thick, unbroken canopy of ancient leaves, its pillars the great, gnarled trunks of oak and beech and other, stranger, darker trees whose names he did not know. The ground was a thick, damp carpet of fallen leaves that had been accumulating for centuries, a soft, silent floor that deadened the sound of his footsteps. The air was still and close, and the silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive quiet that seemed to press in on him from all sides. For many days, he journeyed through this endless, twilight world. He moved with a ranger's stealth, a silent, grey ghost flitting from one great tree trunk to another. The trail of Gollum was much harder to follow here. The soft, leafy ground did not hold a footprint for long. He had to rely now on his other, more subtle skills. He followed the signs that only a man of the wild could read, a single, strangely broken twig on a low-hanging branch, a patch of disturbed, black moss on the side of a great root, the faint, lingering, foul, and fishy scent of the creature on the still air. And he followed the faintest of paths, a secret, hidden track that seemed to wind its way through the darkest and most tangled parts of the wood, a path that suggested his quarry was not just passing through this forest, but was at home in its dark and sorrowful heart. As he ventured deeper, he began to feel the strange and insidious magic of the forest itself working upon his mind. The path would seem to twist and turn back upon itself. The trees, which had at first seemed merely ancient and foreboding, now began to take on strange and menacing shapes in the dim, green light. Great, gnarled roots would seem to writhe like serpents in the shadows at the edge of his vision. The low-hanging branches of the ancient trees would seem to reach for him with long, grasping, wooden fingers. And whispers, strange, sibilant, and unsettling whispers, would seem to follow him, always just at the edge of his hearing, promises of rest, of despair, of the sweet, quiet oblivion of giving up and lying down to sleep forever in the deep, soft, and welcoming bed of leaves. He felt his own senses beginning to betray him, his sense of direction, his very sense of time, beginning to dissolve in the great, green, and magical twilight of the wood. He was a man who had spent his entire life in the wild places, but he had never encountered a wilderness as alive, as hostile, and as hungry as this one. He had to fight against the forest's enchantment with all the strength of his Dunedain will. He would focus his mind on a single, clear thought, the memory of the sun on the green hills of the Shire, the sound of the laughter of the Hobbit children, the simple, good, and beautiful world he had sworn to protect. He would draw the elven waybread from his pack, and its clean, wholesome taste seemed to push back, for a time, against the sweet, cloying scent of decay that filled the air. And he would touch the hilt of his sword, its familiar, solid weight a comforting anchor of reality in this world of shadow and illusion. It was on the 10th day of his journey through the great forest that he stumbled into the heart of its deepest and most ancient evil. The trail of Gollum had led him into a part of the wood where the trees were even larger, their branches so thick and so intertwined that they blocked out the light almost completely. He was moving through a world of profound and absolute darkness, his path lit only by the faint, shimmering light of his own elven blade, which now began to glow with a pale, cold, blue light, a sure sign that orcs, or other foul creatures, were near. And as he crept forward, he walked into it. A great, thick, and sticky strand of it stretched across the path. A web. He looked up, and in the faint, blue glow of his sword, he saw them. All around him, hanging from the high, dark branches of the ancient trees, were great, thick, and ghostly white webs, their strands as thick as rope. And in the center of these webs, he saw dark, hunched, and terrible shapes, great, black, and hairy forms with many, glistening, unblinking eyes. These were the great spiders of Mirkwood, the monstrous and ancient children of the last great spider of the elder days, Shelob. He had stumbled into their lair. A profound and primal fear, a fear colder and sharper than any he had felt before, seized him. He stood frozen, his heart a frantic, trapped bird in his chest. The silence here was absolute, but it was not an empty silence. It was the patient, watchful, and hungry silence of the hunter. He could feel their many eyes upon him, watching him from the darkness. He knew that the slightest sound, the slightest misstep, would bring them down upon him in a silent, swift, and terrible rush. He drew his long knife, and with movements so slow, so deliberate that they seemed to take an eternity, he began to cut his way through the thick, sticky strands of the web that blocked his path. Each cut was a silent prayer. Each movement a contest of will against the terror that threatened to overwhelm him. And as he worked, he realized something that filled him with a new and grudging respect for the creature he was hunting. Gollum had passed this way. He had moved through this terrible, web-choked darkness with an ease and a silence that even he, a ranger of the north, could not hope to match. Gollum, he understood, was not just a creature of the dark, he was a master of it. He had used this place of terror as a shield, as a barrier, knowing that few, if any, of his pursuers would have the skill, or the courage, to follow him through it. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Talîon cut through the last of the webs and found himself in a small, blessedly clear space. He did not run. He backed away slowly, silently, his eyes still fixed on the dark, watchful shapes in the high branches, until he was sure he was beyond the borders of their terrible kingdom. Only then did he allow himself to rest, his back against the trunk of a great oak, his body trembling, his breath coming in great, shuddering gasps. He had survived. He pressed on, his journey through the forest now a blur of weary, gray days and long, watchful nights. The encounter with the spiders had changed him. The forest no longer felt merely hostile, it felt actively, intelligently malevolent. But the experience had also sharpened him, burned away any last vestiges of complacency, and filled him with a new, hard, and unyielding determination. And at last, after many more long and difficult days, he began to feel a change in the air. A faint, almost imperceptible breeze began to stir the stagnant air of the forest. The thick, green twilight began to thin, and he could see, for the first time in many weeks, small, brilliant patches of blue sky through the high canopy of leaves. And he could hear a new sound, the cheerful, familiar sound of birdsong. He was approaching the eastern edge of the great forest. The long, dark, and terrible trial of Mirkwood was almost at an end. He emerged from the last of the ancient trees and stood upon a high bank, looking out at the sunlit lands that lay before him. The great forest was now behind him, a dark and brooding wall of green and shadow. He had been lost within its depths, and he had found his way through. And he knew, with a quiet and weary certainty, that the hunt was not yet over, but that its most perilous and most suffocating chapter was now finally, blessedly, complete. The sun on his face felt like a forgotten blessing. After the long, green, and suffocating twilight of Mirkwood, the open, windswept lands to the east of the forest felt like a paradise of light and air. Talîon stood on a high hill, the great, dark wall of the forest now behind him, and he took a deep, clean breath, purging the last of the wood's cloying, sweet scent of decay from his lungs. He had survived. He had passed through the lair of the great spiders and had resisted the forest's dark, whispering enchantments. He was weary, his clothes were tattered, and his heart was heavy with the knowledge of the darkness he had witnessed. But he was alive, and the hunt was still on. The trail of Gollum was easier to follow here, in the open lands. The creature, now free of the tangled woods, was moving with a greater speed, its path leading southward, along the eastern banks of the great river Anduin. Talîon followed, his own tireless, ranger's stride eating up the miles. He moved through the brown lands, a desolate and empty region that had never recovered from a great and ancient war. The land here was barren, the soil poor, the grass sparse and brown. It was a place of profound and sorrowful emptiness, a land that seemed to be forever mourning a wound that would not heal. For many days, he followed the faint, but clear, trail. And as he traveled, he began to notice something new. He was no longer the only one on this hunt. He began to find signs of another traveler, another skilled woodsman who was also on the trail of the creature Gollum. He found the remains of a small, expertly built campfire, a fire much like his own, smokeless and discreet. He found a single, clear boot print in a patch of soft mud, the print of a ranger's boot, but one that was not his own. And one evening, as he lay hidden in a rocky outcrop, he saw a distant figure, a tall, cloaked man moving with the same silent, tireless grace as himself, his gaze fixed on the ground, his path following the same winding, purposeful course. Talîon was not surprised. He knew from his council with Elrond and Gandalf that he was not alone in this great hunt. He knew that his kinsman, Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, was also searching for the creature in these southern lands. And now, it seemed, their paths were about to converge. He did not call out. He did not reveal his presence. In the silent, unwritten code of the Dunedain, two rangers on a similar mission would not approach each other directly unless it was necessary. They would observe, they would watch, they would trust in the skill of their kinsmen, each of them a silent, solitary guardian, their individual paths now part of a shared, unspoken purpose. The hunt led them further and further south, into the wild and beautiful lands of Ithilien. This was a land that lay on the very borders of the dark land of Mordor, and though the shadow of the mountains to the east cast a long and menacing pall over it, the land itself was still fair. Here, among the groves of tamarisk and the fragrant wild herbs, the signs of Gollum's passage became more recent, more frantic. The creature was close to its old master's land, and it was growing desperate. It was in a small, hidden dell, under the shade of a grove of ancient, gnarled olive trees, that the two rangers finally met. Talîon had been tracking a fresh set of Gollum's prints that led down to a small, clear stream. And as he knelt by the water's edge, another figure emerged silently from the shadows of the trees on the far side of the stream. He was a younger man than Talîon, his face lean and keen, his gray eyes holding a light, a fire, a hint of a kingly authority that Talîon had not seen in any man's face for many long years. His dark hair was shaggy and streaked with gray, and his clothes were as worn and as travel-stained as Talîon's own. But there was a power about him, a quiet, commanding presence that spoke of a great and noble lineage. This was Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the chieftain of the Dunedain of the north. The two men looked at each other across the stream, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. A long, silent moment passed between them, a moment of mutual recognition, of shared understanding, of a deep and unspoken kinship. They were two faces of the same coin, two generations of the same long, lonely watch. "You have led a long and difficult chase, my friend," Aragorn said, his voice a low and pleasant rumble. His eyes fell upon the tracks by Talîon's feet. "It seems our paths have finally met. I have been following him from the south. He is close. Very close. I have followed him from the north, through the darkness of Mirkwood," Talîon replied, his own voice rough from long disuse. "He is cunning. And he knows these lands well." They joined forces, their combined skill as trackers now a formidable weapon. They knew that Gollum, being a creature of darkness, would not move in the open during the day. He would be hiding, waiting for the cover of night. And so, they began a systematic search of the surrounding area, of every cave, every crevice, every dark and tangled thicket where such a creature might conceal itself. For 2 days, they searched, their movements a silent, coordinated dance of two master hunters. And on the evening of the second day, as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, they found him. He was hiding in a small, dark cave, half hidden behind a waterfall that cascaded down a rocky cliff face. They heard him first, a strange, low, gurgling sound, a miserable, self-pitying whisper as he spoke to himself in the darkness. "My precious," the voice hissed. "They stole it from us, my precious. We must find it. We must get it back. Nasty hobbitses. We hates them." Aragorn gave Talîon a silent signal. And then, in a single, swift, and coordinated movement, they burst into the cave. The creature, Gollum, shrieked, a high, thin, and terrible sound, as the sudden light of their torches seared his large, pale, and sensitive eyes. He was a pitiable and a horrifying sight, a small, emaciated creature, his skin a pale, sickly white, his long, thin limbs ending in large, splayed hands and feet. He fought with a desperate, surprising strength, his long, sharp teeth snapping, his thin, wiry arms flailing. But he was no match for the too powerful Dunedain. They subdued him, binding his hands and his feet with a strong, slender cord. The hunt was over. They led their captive northward, away from the borders of Mordor. It was a long and difficult journey, for the creature Gollum was a troublesome and a cunning prisoner. He would whine and he would plead, he would curse and he would spit. And at night, he would try to gnaw through his bonds, his eyes gleaming with a cold and miserable hatred in the firelight. During this long journey, the two rangers spoke little, but a deep and profound bond was formed between them. Talîon saw in the younger man the future of his people. He saw the fire of kingship, the strength and the wisdom that might one day reunite the scattered remnants of the Dunedain and restore the great kingdoms of old. And Aragorn, in turn, saw in the older ranger the embodiment of their people's long and thankless duty. He saw the quiet, enduring strength, the deep, weary wisdom of a man who had spent a lifetime on the long watch, a man who had sacrificed everything, home, comfort, renown, for the sake of a duty that the world had long ago forgotten. It was a silent passing of the torch, a quiet affirmation of a shared and sacred purpose. They brought their prisoner at last to the borders of Mirkwood, where they were met by a company of elves from the woodland realm of King Thranduil. They handed Gollum over to the elves, who would hold him as a prisoner, and who would, in time, question him further, seeking to learn all that he knew of the enemy's plans. As the elves led the miserable, hissing creature away into the shadows of the great forest, Talîon and Aragorn stood together on a small hill, watching them go. Their shared task was complete. "You have done a great service, Talîon," Aragorn said, placing a hand on the older ranger's shoulder. "Gandalf will be pleased. You have earned a long rest." Talîon looked at the younger man, at the future king, and he gave a small, weary smile. "There is no rest for our people, son of Arathorn," he said quietly. "Not yet. The shadow is gathering. The great war is coming. My watch is not over. It has just begun." Aragorn nodded, his own face now grave. He knew that the older ranger spoke the truth. Their paths would now diverge once more. Aragorn's own destiny would lead him south, to the great events of the War of the Ring, to the Fellowship, to the paths of the dead, and ultimately, to the throne of Gondor. And Talion's path would lead him back to the north, back to the lonely, empty lands of Eriador, back to his long, quiet, and now even more dangerous watch. They clasped arms, a warrior's farewell, a silent acknowledgement of their shared blood and their shared duty. And then, without another word, they turned and went their separate ways. Aragorn disappeared southward, a tall, swift figure, his destiny calling him to the great stage of history. And Talîon, the quiet, forgotten guardian, turned his face northward, a lone, gray shadow, melting back into the wilderness that was his only true home, his heart now filled with the heavy burden of a new and terrible knowledge, and with the quiet, enduring strength of a shared and noble purpose. As the last, miserable hisses of the creature Gollum faded into the deep, green silence of the Mirkwood, a profound and heavy quiet settled over the two Dunedain. They stood together on a small, windswept hill at the edge of the great forest, two solitary, grey-cloaked figures against the vast, empty landscape of the north. Their shared task was complete. The creature, with its terrible secret, was now in the safekeeping of the elves. The immediate danger had been contained. But both men knew, with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the stones beneath their feet, that this was not an ending. It was merely the end of the beginning. For a long while, they stood in silence, watching the last of the elven company disappear into the twilight of the woods. The air was cool and clean, and the first, pale stars of evening were beginning to appear in the deep, violet sky. The long hunt was over, and in the quiet that followed, a new and more profound weariness seemed to settle upon Talîon's spirit. It was the weariness not of the body, but of the soul, the weariness of a man who has spent a lifetime holding back a relentless tide, only to feel it now gathering its strength for a final, overwhelming surge. It was in this quiet moment, as the world seemed to be holding its breath between the fading of one day and the dawning of another, that a new presence made itself known. From the shadows of a nearby grove of ancient birch trees, a third figure emerged, walking toward them with a slow, deliberate, and familiar gait. He was an old man, wrapped in a gray cloak, his long, white beard a river of silver in the dim twilight, his wise, keen eyes seeming to hold the light of the very stars he walked beneath. It was Gandalf the Grey, the Mithrander, who seemed to possess an uncanny knack for appearing at the most pivotal of moments. "You have done well," the wizard said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to be a part of the ancient landscape itself. He looked from Aragorn to Talîon, and his gaze lingered for a moment on the older ranger, a look of profound understanding and of a deep, shared sorrow. "You have caught the scent of the enemy, and you have followed it to its source. The creature is now where he can do no more harm, for a time. You have both earned a long and peaceful rest." "There is no peace to be had, Mithrander," Talîon replied, his own voice quiet and heavy. "Not anymore. I have seen the signs in the north. I have heard the whispers in the south. The shadow is not just stirring, it is stretching out its hand. This hunt for a single, miserable creature is but a small part of a much larger and darker game." Gandalf nodded slowly, his gaze now turned eastward, toward the distant, dark, and menacing peaks of the misty mountains, and beyond them, toward the black and barren land of Mordor. "You speak the truth, Talîon," he said. "The long, quiet years of your watch are coming to an end. The peace of this age, a peace that has been bought at the price of your people's long and lonely vigilance, is now a fragile and a fleeting thing. A great storm is coming, and it will sweep over all the lands of Middle-earth." And so, in the gathering darkness, on that lonely hill at the edge of Mirkwood, the three of them sat and held a council. And Gandalf, with a voice that held the weight of all the long and sorrowful years of the world, began to weave together the scattered threads of the story that Talîon had only partially understood. He spoke of the great ring of power, of its long and terrible history, and of its reappearance in the quiet, forgotten corner of the world that was the Shire. He confirmed that the Dark Lord, Sauron, now knew that the ring had survived, and that he was bending his entire will, his entire power, to finding it. "The enemy is moving," Gandalf said, his voice a low and urgent whisper. "His power grows daily in the land of Mordor. The fires of the mountain are stirring once more. He is gathering to him all the evil things of the world, orcs and trolls, and evil men from the east and the south. And he has sent forth his most terrible servants, the Nine, the Ringwraiths, the Nazgul, to scour the lands for the one thing he needs to cover all the world in a second darkness." He then looked at Talîon, his eyes filled with a new and profound gravity. "And that is why your long watch has been of such immense and vital importance, Talîon of the Dunedain," he said. "For centuries, you and your kinsmen have patrolled these empty lands. The world has forgotten you. The very people you protect look upon you with suspicion and with fear. They call you Strider, a wanderer with no home. They do not know that you are the last remnants of the great kings of old, the guardians of a lost kingdom, the silent sentinels who have kept the peace of this land for 1,000 years. While you have kept the roads clear of the servants of the enemy, while you have hunted the orcs and the other foul creatures that crept down from the mountains, you have, without knowing it, been guarding something far more precious than the borders of a small and peaceful land. You have been guarding the ring itself. A profound and heavy silence fell upon Talîon as he heard these words. He looked at his own weathered hands, at the calluses on his palms, at the old, faded scars that were a map of his long and weary life. He thought of the endless, lonely nights on watch, of the cold, bitter winters, of the constant, gnawing feeling of being a forgotten stranger in his own ancestral lands. And he understood, for the first time, the true and terrible meaning of his long and lonely duty. All those years, all those quiet, thankless patrols, all the small, unseen battles fought in the shadows of forgotten ruins, they had not been just a duty of memory. They had been the very shield that had protected the world from a second, and perhaps a final, darkness. The time for that kind of watch is now over, Gandalf continued, his voice now a somber bell, tolling the end of an age. The enemy now knows of the Shire. The ring cannot remain there. It must be taken to the one place where it can be unmade, to the fires of Mount Doom, in the very heart of the enemy's land. A new quest is beginning, a quest upon which the fate of this entire age will turn. Talîon looked at Aragorn, and he saw in the younger man's keen, grey eyes a reflection of his own sorrow, but also a new and powerful fire of determination. He knew now that his own part in this great story was drawing to a close, and that the torch of his people's long struggle was now passing to a new generation. Aragorn's destiny would lead him southward, to the great events of the War of the Ring, to the Fellowship, to the paths of the dead, and ultimately, to the throne of Gondor and the renewal of the great kingdoms of men. He was the hope of the Dúnedain, the hope of all the free peoples of Middle-earth. And what of his own destiny? What was the role of an old watchman in a world that was about to be plunged into a great and open war? He knew he could not take the ring. He knew he was not the heir of Isildur. His part was a quieter one, a more humble one, but one that was, he now understood, no less important. The war will not only be fought in the south, he said at last, his voice quiet but steady. If the shadow is stirring in Angmar and in Gundabad, then the north will also need its guardians. The passes of the mountains must be watched. The borders of the Shire must still be protected. If all our strength is drawn southward to fight the great battles, a shadow may creep in from behind. Gandalf looked at him, and a look of deep and profound respect shone in the old wizard's eyes. "You speak with the wisdom of one who has long been a guardian," he said. "You are right. A great darkness is coming, and it will be a war fought on many fronts. The north must not be forgotten." And so, in the quiet of that starlit night, their council came to an end. Their paths were now clear. The great age of the long, lonely watch was over. And a new, terrible, and glorious age of open war was about to begin. It was the end of an age, the end of the long, slow, quiet twilight of the Dúnedain of the north, and the beginning of the great, fiery dawn of the age of the king. The farewell on that lonely hill at the edge of Mirkwood was a quiet one, a simple clasping of arms between two kinsmen who understood, without the need for many words, the different and dangerous paths that now lay before them. Aragorn turned his face to the south, towards the great stage of history, towards the gathering of the fellowship and the wars and the kingship that were his destiny. And Talîon, the older ranger, the silent watchman, turned his face back to the north, back to the empty, lonely lands that had been his only home for so many long and weary years. His journey northward was different from all the journeys that had come before. He moved with the same tireless, loping gait, his senses just as keen, his knowledge of the wild just as profound. But his heart was now filled with a new and heavy burden. The world, which had always seemed to him a vast, ancient, and sorrowful place, now seemed also incredibly fragile, a place of small, precious pockets of light surrounded by a vast and encroaching darkness. And he now understood, with a terrible and beautiful clarity, that he and his scattered kinsmen were the guardians of one of the last of those lights. He traveled through the brown lands once more, but he saw them now not just as a desolate wasteland, but as a scar, a wound left upon the earth by the great shadow that was now rising again. He crossed the great river Anduin, its waters a deep and powerful current, and he thought of the ring that had lain hidden in its depths for so long, and of the brave, small hobbit who had, against all chance, found it and carried it away. He passed through the haunted emptiness of the lone lands, and the crumbling ruins of the ancient watchtowers on the hills seemed to speak to him now with a new and more urgent voice, whispering not just of a glory that was lost, but of a danger that was returning. After many long and weary weeks of travel, he finally reached the familiar, rolling hills that marked the borders of the land he had sworn to protect. He crested a low ridge, and there it was, spread out before him in the gentle light of a setting sun, the Shire. He stood for a long time, a silent, gray figure hidden in a thicket of gorse, looking down upon the peaceful, patchwork landscape. He saw the winding streams, the small, stone bridges, the neat, well-tended fields. And he saw the hobbit holes, their round, painted doors nestled into the green hillsides. From their chimneys, the familiar, comforting wisps of wood smoke were beginning to rise, carrying on the evening breeze the scent of hearth fires and of suppers being prepared. He could hear, in the quiet air, the faint, distant sound of laughter from a village inn, and the cheerful, off-key singing of a hobbit returning home from his fields. It was a scene of such perfect, such profound, and such innocent peace that it caught at his heart with a new and almost painful intensity. For years, he had watched over this land. He had seen it as a duty, a responsibility passed down to him through generations, a solemn and joyless task. But now, for the first time, he saw it not just as a duty, but as a treasure. He saw it through the eyes of Gandalf, as a small, quiet, and beautiful garden in a world that was growing dark and cold. He saw the hobbits not as a simple, foolish folk, but as the keepers of a rare and precious kind of courage, the courage of the small, the courage of the gentle, the courage to find joy in simple things. He understood now why this small, forgotten corner of the world was so important. It was a light, a memory of what the world could be, of what it should be. And he understood that his own long, lonely, and thankless life had been a price willingly paid to keep that small, beautiful light from being extinguished. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared below the horizon, and as the first, bright, evening stars began to appear in the deep, violet sky, Talîon did not make a fire. He did not seek his rest. He stood his watch, his gaze sweeping over the sleeping land below him. The lights in the small, round windows of the hobbit holes began to go out, one by one, as the hobbits, their bellies full, their hearts untroubled, went to their warm and comfortable beds. He was their guardian, their unseen shield. They did not know of him, they would never thank him, but he would give his life for them, gladly. He thought of the great war that was coming, of the terrible darkness that was gathering in the east. He thought of his kinsmen, Aragorn, journeying south to meet his great destiny. And he thought of his own, quieter, but no less important, role in the great struggle to come. The north was not safe. The shadows were stirring in the ruins of Angmar, and the goblins were multiplying in the high passes of the mountains. His watch was not over. It was more important now than it had ever been. He stood there all through the long, cold, and silent night, alone, grey sentinel on the borders of the light. He was a memory of a lost kingdom, a guardian of a fragile peace, a hero whose name would never be sung in any great hall. But as the first, pale light of a new dawn began to touch the eastern sky, his heart was not filled with sorrow or with despair. It was filled with a quiet, unyielding, and profound sense of purpose. The age of the rangers was ending. The age of the king was about to begin. But until that new dawn had fully broken, the watch must be kept. He pulled his grey cloak tighter around him, and with his eyes fixed on the dark and troubled lands to the north, he turned and melted back into the shadows, a silent, tireless protector, returning to his long and lonely war. And so, our own journey with this quiet guardian comes to its gentle close. His story, like the countless stars above him, is one of a silent, constant, and often unseen light, a light that holds back the darkness. It is a reminder that the greatest acts of courage are not always found on the great battlefields of history, but in the quiet, lonely watches of the night, in the steadfast, unwavering commitment to protect the good, the innocent, and the beautiful. As Talîon continues his long watch, let his quiet strength and his profound sense of purpose be a comfort to you now. Let the gentle, rolling hills of the Shire, and the peace he so fiercely protects, be the landscape of your own dreams. The great struggles of the world can wait until the morning. The time for watching, for worrying, for journeying, is over. All that remains now, is to rest. Good night, dear listener. And may all your dreams be peaceful.